Conspiracies over the phone, in person, in public, behind closed doors, and the factor of Hungary's Orban. Is there even a theoretical chance that perhaps in Budapest Trump could manage to force Kremlin's Putin to stop the war against Ukraine? Drones, aircraft, submarines, and now even an armed unit without insignia? All of this of Moscow origin, in the sky, at sea, and just a step away from the interstate border with Western European countries. Is the Kremlin really preparing to attack NATO? Yes. Round-the-clock terror in a big city across a great river. What is the current operational situation in the Dnieper floodplain opposite Kherson? And is it possible to shield the city from enemy long-range attacks? Hello everyone, this is The Duty Officer, an overview project from the Spats editorial team. To understand the geography of the front, as usual, we will use the online map from State Map, which the developers of the resource have kindly allowed us to use in the program. And today's special correspondent guest is Serhiy Kuzan, head of the Ukrainian Center for Security and Cooperation. Mr. Serhiy, welcome. Thank you for finding the time to join us. Hello, thank you for the invitation. Anchorage version 2.0. Is it really possible for anything worthwhile to come out of Budapest? After Trump's phone conversation with Putin last week, and then Zelensky's personal meeting with Trump on Friday, October 17th in Washington, it became clear that neither Tomahawk missiles nor effective security guarantees from the US will be provided, at least not for now. In fact, there's really nothing else to say about the outcome of the meeting between the Ukrainians and the Americans, except for the usual cautiously optimistic statements from both sides, claiming that diplomatic efforts to end the Russian aggression are still ongoing. Of course, it's possible that not everything is being made public. On the other hand, the Chancellor of Germany, commenting on the results of the meeting in Washington, expressed the opinion that Zelensky's visit to the US did not go as Ukraine had hoped. At the same time, on Sunday, the Washington Post reported that Trump's special envoy Volker allegedly pressured Ukrainian officials during negotiations to hand over Donetsk region to Moscow's control. The president of Ukraine, speaking about the results of the meeting with Trump, admitted that the territorial issue would be the most difficult in a possible negotiation process with Russia. However, at this stage, Zelensky considers the main task to be achieving a ceasefire. Probably, not least of all, this is what the US president will personally discuss with the Kremlin war criminal when they meet again, likely within the next 2 weeks. Now, in the capital of Hungary, it seems that new Orban there is already busy rolling out the red carpet for both of them. Serhiy, in your opinion, is there a chance that in Budapest, perhaps not least because of a certain symbolism, something truly, let's say, positively groundbreaking could happen to put an end to the Russian aggression?
I don't believe in any kind of breakthrough events, although, of course, this war could be stopped literally in a single day. And for that, of course, it would be necessary to double the efforts of Europe and the United States. And I am convinced that the decisions of Putin and his inner circle could also follow quickly. But our war is so enormous, it affects so many spheres of life in, at the very least, all of Europe, that the world hasn't seen a war like this since World War II. And that's why the process of ending this war, which of course includes stopping it, reaching certain agreements and establishing a new geopolitical structure, because wars like this are never just local. In other words, the world map changes and spheres of influence are redistributed. Exactly so. And it is precisely for this greater global context that a struggle is underway today without exaggeration. But in this struggle, unlike in the previous 30 years of our independence, we are now a subject in our own right. And everything we remember from February, that conversation which was, well, radically different, the conversation in the White House in February, and now the meeting between the presidents of the United States and Ukraine, the meeting of their teams, we saw a completely different tone. And what is being said is that, well, that Witkov, who, well, holds a rather formal position as special representative.
But he has close ties with Moscow?
Of course. He has to do that because of his position. He has to establish good relations. But the fact that he might have tried to voice, so to speak, some Russian demands just for the sake of formality, their so-called wish list, and the fact that they would not be accepted, that they would be rejected, there was never any doubt about that. And we saw this precisely in the people around Trump and in the reaction of the President of the United States himself. When he believed that we were in a weak position in February, when it was possible to apply pressure, any talks by President Zelensky about guarantees, any attempts to show the realities, so to speak, to lay out the map of this war were harshly rejected. Now, this is no longer happening. We saw that the president was there, the head of the office was there, government representatives were there, and the person responsible for the war on behalf of the president, let's say the deputy Colonel Palisa, was also there. And all of them managed to convincingly communicate to both the American establishment and representatives of the American military-industrial complex how the war is unfolding, what we need for it, and what the next stage will be. Well, and the fact that Trump was already calling Putin from there, and as it turns out, Putin has agreed as of now to Budapest, we don't know what will happen tomorrow. Perhaps Putin will just change his mind. Maybe there won't be any Budapest at all, or it will be postponed. But at the very least, this demonstrates a completely different balance of power regarding Ukraine.
Let's take a direct look at the line of combat engagement. And of course, first and foremost, this is the sector of the front around Pokrovsk, including its northeastern flank, the Dobropilya-Mirnohrad area. And in this area, it seems that the enemy has really started using their armored vehicles and tanks again. In my opinion, and I might be wrong, but it seems to me that the fiercest fighting is now taking place along and around the H-32 highway, which connects the already occupied Bakhmut through Kostiantynivka to Pokrovsk, especially along this highway, particularly on its northern side. To the east and northeast of Mirnohrad in Novoekonomichne, and to the south of Mirolyubivka, this is, so to speak, in general terms. To go into more detail, after a series of rather, I would say, and this is obvious, after a series of quite effective counterattacks by the Ukrainian defense forces, particularly along the stretch from Rubizhyn all the way to Dorozhne in the general eastern direction. In the area from Shakov between Volodymyrivka and Pankivka, all of this is on the western bank of the Kazeni Torets River. The Russians have deployed at least 4 of their separate marine brigades, the 155th, 40th, 61st, 336th, and the 177th separate regiment into the sector of their 51st Combined Arms Army. All of this is concentrated in the area where both the 51st and the 8th Combined Arms Armies are operating. On the eastern bank of the Kazeni Torets River, particularly from Popovy Yar, Poltavka, and Rusinyi Yar, with some focus towards Kostiantynivka, the resistance from the Muscovites here has increased several times over. As a result, and possibly one of the current consequences, it has not yet been possible to fully eliminate these positions. The strongholds in the area of Kucherevye Yar and Novyi Shakovy, which are located south of the M32 highway. At the same time, the Muscovites, mainly with the forces of the 132nd and 114th separate motorized rifle brigades of the 51st Army, and apparently not without the participation of the 39th Motorized Rifle Brigade of the 68th Army Corps. And possibly with the involvement of the 177th Marine Regiment, they carried out a series of mirror counterattacks, primarily from Nikonorivka towards the roadways, as well as in the sector from Sukietsky to Novoekonomichne, in particular with pressure on Rodensky in Krasny Lyman and also in that same Novoekonomichne. And all of this evidently with the main goal, which remains unchanged, to penetrate as deeply as possible from the northeast towards Mirnohrad in order to cut off the T05-15 highway, which is the main route connecting Pokrovsk and the northern rear, and its branches through Kherson, which also leads to Pokrovsk. I would also like to draw attention to another thing here, to everything happening south of the highway, particularly to the area south of Novoekonomichne. Here the Russians managed to cross the Kazani Torets River. As I understand it, the forward assault groups are operating here, primarily from the 5th and 9th separate motorized rifle brigades, as well as the 51st Combined Arms Army. And from the south, the Russians continue to exert pressure on Promin as well. Here, 2 battalions are operating, either motorized rifle or tank battalions, the 382nd and the 1195th, and as you can hear, they have been newly formed again. One way or another, Ukrainian soldiers managed to halt this Russian advance at the Sina River between the villages of Balahan and Kozatske and prevent the Russians from reaching the southeastern outskirts of Mirnohrad, but I suspect that the Russians won't spare the lives of their fighters in order to break through as quickly as possible to 2 locations. These are the 2 highest points in the area, at elevations 224 and 264. These are the tallest spoil heaps of the local mines, obviously, not least for the purpose of controlling the area with the forces and means of unmanned systems. As for directly to Pokrovsk, specifically the area located just south of the city, along the entire length of the line of contact from Molodetsky, so to speak, all the way to the M30 highway Donetsk-Dnipro. Because here, over the past week, the intensity and brutality, the severity of the war that is ongoing here have increased several times over, In particular, the Muscovites, with the main forces of the 27th Motorized Rifle Division and the 30th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade of the 2nd Combined Arms Army, are trying to actively attack in the Zvirovo polygon. Leontovici rose azure green. This is in fact the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk. Apparently they are taking advantage of the fact that they managed to somewhat capture this height of 230 earlier. This is the highest mine shaft of the Shevchenko mine number 21 on the site. One way or another, for the first time this week, almost all monitoring resources showed that at least small areas within Pokrovsk itself were marked in red, which apparently indicates that the Muscovites have entrenched themselves in the city. And in fact, through Kotlin and Nudakne, they continue their active attempts to break through. I assume that if the Muscovites reach the M30 highway through Tutakviza-Hiyivka or approach Hrishin from the south, then there is the Rashi's trash, the 15th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade of that same 2nd Combined Arms Army. But Ukrainian soldiers, particularly in this sector, in the area southwest of the city itself, seize every opportunity and possibility to counterattack the enemy. So the fighting here, without exaggeration, is happening head-on. A few details, some specifics about the situation around Pokrovsk. In the city itself, I hope we have the opportunity to speak with the commander of the Shershny Dovbush Unmanned Systems Battalion of the 68th Separate Jaeger Brigade, named after Alexei Dovbush. Lyuti is on the line with the Spetskor Lyuti studio. Greetings to you. Glory to the heroes. Before I start asking questions, I want to draw our viewers' attention to the QR code that should have already appeared on your screens. This is for a fundraiser for an off-road vehicle, as usual for our warriors of the 68th Jaeger Brigade. Vehicles are as vital as air for them right now, so please don't stay on the sidelines for this fundraiser. Tell me first of all, is there currently an enemy presence right in Pokrovsk?
All resources are reporting that the enemy is present. Previously, they would enter in small numbers as sabotage and reconnaissance groups, and we managed, not always in a timely manner, but in any case, to respond and stabilize the situation, and we cleared them out. But now, at this moment, the enemy is advancing and entering, and it is very difficult to control because they are coming in with large forces.
Is it accurate to say, in the case of Pokrovsk, as of today, at this very moment, that there are street battles taking place in the city? After all, as you yourself mentioned, several monitoring resources have marked certain areas in Pokrovsk in red. Obviously, the enemy has managed to gain a foothold there. Are these infantry close contact clashes happening right now? Or is it all exclusively drone activity?
Unfortunately, such incidents do occur. In fact, I'll tell you more. There are even cases of firefights between UAV crews and mortar units. Unfortunately, the enemy is moving chaotically through the city. I wouldn't say they've clearly established their positions or are controlling a specific area in a coordinated way. But in any case, these chaotic movements are causing disorder even in our own positions. And we have to worry about our own safety at our positions rather than focusing on the front line and eliminating the enemy as they approach.
Tell me, Lyuti, considering the way the Russians are conducting their attacks, maybe the use of armored vehicles if they're starting to appear again in the area, and the intensity of these enemy assaults, if you compare all of last September to these 3 weeks of October, are these periods similar in terms of how the Muscovites are waging war? Have there been any differences?
Absolutely, it's a drastic change. The war changes every month. And if you look at it over the course of a year, I can tell you that the infantry in 2022 to 2023, it was more like they were at a resort compared to what it's like now. Our guys are bravely holding their positions because anything can hit any position now. A ton of drones and all sorts of things are flying in, and it's really hard to be there right now. The enemy is also modernizing, learning, and they no longer use the same tactics as before. There used to be massive assaults where we could destroy, I don't know, up to 50, and there were even days when we could eliminate up to 100 enemy personnel. Well, on average, it was around 50. Now it's isolated movements that are very hard to detect and take a long time to drive out. And they very rarely use armored vehicles now. Sometimes, of course, they do use them because we are also destroying their logistics, so they have to spend a long time reaching the line of contact on foot. If an infantryman has to walk more than 10 kilometers in full gear with supplies, it's clear that he won't be able to assault after that. That's why sometimes they use armored vehicles, trying to bring the infantry as close to the positions as possible.
Lyuti, let me ask you one last thing. In mid-October, there was, well, at least what? According to open sources, there was a significant redeployment of some units of the enemy's 41st Combined Arms Army, which had been attacking for a long time in the southwestern sector from Pokrovsk. In connection with this in particular, the 90th Tank Division was moved to the 74th Brigade at the junction of the Novopavlivka and Velikomikhaylivka sectors. Has the possible intensity of artillery shelling changed in any way because of this? There again, as you already mentioned, the appearance of armored vehicles. After all, I repeat, the 90th Tank Division was moved there first and foremost.
In any case, the use of armored vehicles is rare because we destroy a lot of them if they approach. These are rare cases. I'll put it this way, the movement of any combat unit makes our work much more difficult. The enemy has always put significant effort into the Pokrovsk direction, specifically targeting the city of Pokrovsk. They maneuver around and get close to our logistical routes. On the screen. Right now, we've actually run into a problem where we also have to walk a lot on foot. We buy vehicles and we end up moving on foot for long periods, and a lot of our cars have been destroyed. That's why we're currently raising funds for a vehicle, because over 14 of my cars have been destroyed in just a few months. But in any case, we keep working and will continue to destroy the enemy relentlessly.
Luci, thank you very much. Once again, I want to draw viewers' attention to the QR code. As just confirmed, this vehicle is as essential as air for our soldiers, so please don't stand aside. Help Luci. Thank you, and please take care of yourself and your soldiers. Thank you, thank you. Serhiy, tell us, we've already mentioned that even the most conservative, I would say, monitoring resources are showing the enemy's presence. There were even reports in the city. Some added that in the area of the central cemetery along Privilna Street, there were allegedly attempts by them to enter towards the defenders of Ukraine Avenue. Tell us, is this the most significant enemy advance in a month south of the city? Because there haven't been any others. Does this mean that, as of now, the Russians have formed a sufficiently large grouping of forces and troops south of Pokrovsk, including both flanks, to launch a massive assault?
Here we need to talk about concentration, not just about the grouping itself. These groupings number between 100,000 and 110,000 personnel alone. We are also talking about the accumulated equipment, but the question is whether it will be possible to secretly concentrate enough manpower in any of these areas to be able to break through, well, essentially our wall of drones. Because in these weather conditions we see autumn, fog, rain, in other words, high humidity. This means, according to the Russians' calculations, that we will not be able to fully use our drones in this particular direction. And it will be possible, in small groups, using this infiltration method, to enter and try to establish a foothold. Well, 90% get destroyed there, but in about 10% of cases, it's possible to hold a position. That's precisely why the Russians are using their heavy equipment. So we can generally and roughly track their heavy equipment movements over time, because in order to successfully assault any position, the very first thing you need to do is to carefully amass and gather your troops. Indeed, the commander was right when he said that their fighters, these so-called zombie squads they send in, are just used to exhaust our drone units and our mortar teams. And of course, they can't carry out a full-scale assault. In other words, their advance, even their mere presence on the outskirts of Pokrovsk, does not guarantee control over the city at all. We saw excellent work from our paratroopers. They went out, cleared the area near the train station, and that was it. The enemy group was gone. So everything they had been doing for such a long and extended period of time was essentially eliminated by our rapid response airborne assault group. So now the Russians are trying to make use of the main key paved roads and this kind of weather to actually launch new assaults, but this time with the use of heavy equipment, including armored vehicles. At the moment, all these assaults have been successfully repelled. However, the slow creeping advance continues to unfold, moving forward at a steady and deliberate pace, and of course the ultimate goal is simply to exhaust and wear down our forward units over time.
You mentioned the buildup. Obviously, the movement of the so-called Marine Corps, almost all units except for the 810th Brigade, definitely means a concentration of combat formations. At the same time, the 41st Combined Arms Army is being moved to a sector even further south. What does this mean? In my opinion, this is an attempt to create another flanking maneuver through Novopavlivka and Mezhova, this time along the southwestern front in order to encircle the entire Pokrovsk-Mirnograd agglomeration already on the territory of Dnipropetrovsk region. Or is it about something else?
Well, of course, after the Russian military forces attempted to storm Pokrovsk head on, basically from the east, they failed to do so. Overall, we're talking about the Pokrovsk-Mirnorod agglomeration. After that, they decided to go for a small encirclement, because we remember that here it's a small encirclement, and further on the map we can see a larger one.
Here it is, and now let's try to demonstrate this. Pokrovsk, here it is. The small encirclement we're talking about now is obviously through Kotlin, and then further through Novopavlivka, which is apparently the second option and with the same goal as before. But so far, we don't see either one or the other happening.
Absolutely. And in this case, the enemy's plans were thwarted because now all the marine infantry units are here, and we can see redeployments from the Zaporizhzhia direction, even from as far as Sumy region, from the Kharkiv direction as well, in order to amass additional reserves here and essentially unblock these units and positions that the Russians do not want to lose. In other words, there is a very fierce fight going on right now, specifically in the Dobropilia direction, over whether they will succeed after all. To finish off the Russians here, and whether the Russians will manage to unblock their own units here, which they are trying to save. And right now it's very hard to say. The resilience of this
defense area, as the coordinator of the information resistance wrote just the other day, that the entire resilience of the Pokrovsk civilian defense area will depend on the northeastern flank.
Of course, there can be different assessments, and overall, every direction here is, of course, very important and very difficult for us. But again, everything is determined by the availability of resources. As long as we hold the defense and inflict greater losses on the enemy, it makes sense to hold any defensive line. So at the moment, the very fact that the entire front line has narrowed to this Donetsk direction in Donetsk region, which speaks to the effectiveness of our defensive operation. Moreover, where we are counterattacking, we are also reclaiming positions, inflicting damage, and pushing deeper into their lines. And here is what the Russians feared most, the cutting off of exactly the isolation of this main bridgehead. That's why they were redeploying their forces there. In fact,
these two sections, obviously on the western bank of the Kazani and Rits rivers.
Exactly. That is, once again, we see that our defense is being built along water obstacles. There's no secret about that. Well, and the Russians' objective, of course, is to preserve their gains, and they are willing to pay a disproportionately high price for it.
Let's talk more about the southern operational zone today. It would be inappropriate to overlook it. We don't touch on it very often, but first and foremost, let's talk about the far southwest, where in fact the line of contact stretches for more than 90 kilometers along the Dnipro riverbed and the islands in the river's floodplain. One way or another, it's obvious, both the sheer length of the line of contact, over 90 kilometers, and the complexity of this sector clearly infuriate the Moscow horde, which is called the Dnipro Enemy Forces Group. Before certain units were redeployed to other parts of the front, there were nearly 70,000 Russian occupiers stationed here. And despite the fact that this is not the most intense section of the front, at least for now, Ukrainian soldiers just since the beginning, in a few years, at least 8,000 Muscovites have been turned into unquestionably good ones, and that's already a decent result. The main battles here will flare up on the stretch from Raibalshe and Kizomys to Lviv and Korsunka. This doesn't mean that there aren't battles happening near Novokakhovka. There are, and on Kozatsky Island, fighting happens very often, but it is precisely on the traverse from Kherson and a bit further south along the river that the Muscovites, of course, try every day to land troops to carry out their raids and sorties. The islands of Nestriga, Kozuliski, Veliki Vilkovi, Bilogrudi. From time to time, there are reports that even Karantin, which is actually right up against the western bank, is a territory of the most intense clashes. But despite the fact that almost all of this territory today is in the so-called gray zone, the Ukrainian military command insists that Ukrainians control this entire territory and literally destroy every attempt by the Muscovites to land on the right bank, on the western bank, in order to approach the development on the right bank. But first and foremost, when we talk about the Kherson region, we have to talk about the virtually non-stop remote shelling of Kherson itself and all the settlements that are within range of enemy mortars, artillery and drones. Speaking about the southern sector, of course, we cannot overlook the Melitopol direction, which is another area of intense confrontations in particular. along the M18 highway. Right now, we have the opportunity to learn a few details about the operational situation in the southern sector. Natalka Nahorna, our war correspondent. Natalka, I understand that you managed to get into the coastal zone. What is the current situation in the floodplain and opposite the regional center? And are there any signs that the Russians might be preparing some kind of river crossing?
Hello, Alexander. In fact, we had to work with the military at a distance from the Dnieper because the coastal zone of the Dnieper is not even a gray zone. It's what's called a kill zone, where it's extremely difficult just to survive. Let's just take a look now at the road to Kherson, a settlement where more than 60,000 people live. There are dozens of kilometers of these kinds of nets, and today a strike drone was already destroyed here on the road. Of course, first of all, both the enemy and our military are trying to take control of logistics, so the enemy is here, and ours, logically, are on the left bank. Because the best chance to spot the enemy in the Kherson region is during their movement. After almost 3 years of the defensive operation, it's clear here that you need to conceal your location in order not to be destroyed. Of course, it's hardest for the artillerymen to hide. Besides, well, this is a steppe zone, and the Dnieper is the front line. Our troops, of course, are present both on the left bank and on the islands, but at the moment this is not preparation for assault operations. As the military say, this is about maintaining parity.
The longer you stay in the same place, the more certain you become that you've been spotted. And if you've been spotted, you'll be killed. Be sure that by morning that basement won't be standing anymore. Everything will hit it. They'll keep destroying it until it's just a pit. It's probably hardest of all for the artillerymen. Because we're all small, everything we have is tiny, but theirs is big. That is, for them to set up that cannon somewhere is a whole complex operation. It's very difficult.
There aren't such massive assaults here as, for example, on the Donetsk or Kharkiv fronts. And it's a drone war, of course, FPV drones and large strike UAVs that hunt enemy targets. And this is exactly what we've been observing. The main danger for us comes from the air, but it's the same for the enemy as well. But here's what has changed, and I can't help but mention it amid all these numerous discussions. About possible ceasefires, about agreements. The military emphasized to us that they've stopped thinking about agreements because this exhausting combat work, which goes on every day and every night, is more important to them than politicians' attempts to negotiate.
Most soldiers, in fact, aren't thinking about victory. Like, we have a job to do, we have our work, and after that, well, whatever happens, happens. Any kind of worldview or vision ends after the first losses and defeats. It's very hard to think about anything truly positive when every day is a struggle.